In this next section, we're going to start talking about conformity and obedience. Conformity is going to be when we adjust our individual behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs to try and meet up with a group standard. And conformity is really essential in a lot of social situations. And for our previous discussion, when we started talking about norms can only exist within a society if people conform to those ideas, to those norms. So all of these concepts are interrelated. So why is it that people are conforming? We're going to talk about two reasons for conformity. The first of which is informational social influence, basically where you conform because you think that others have more knowledge or more information than you do, and that they are probably right and you're probably wrong. So you go along with the group because you assume that the group knows better. The second reason is called normative social influence, where you conform because you want to obtain the awards that come from conforming. So you follow the group because following the group gets you benefits of being part of that group, and it gets you the support of that group. And you also want to avoid rejection. So if you go against that group's views, then maybe they're going to exclude you or punish you in some way. So you're conforming to get the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff. And that's your motivation for going along with the group's views. One experiment that was set up to try and test some of the factors that might affect conformity was set up by Ash in the 1950s, where they had students shown basically the graphic that you can see on the screen here, where you have the A standard line. So this is your comparison point, and they would show you 3 comparison lines, 1, 2, and 3, and they would ask you which line is the same length as line A. And so just from looking at it, you would very quickly say 2, because it's clearly the same length. But imagine that you're sitting in a room with a bunch of other undergraduate students conducting some kind of psychological research, and maybe you're the 4th or 5th person to go, and everybody before you says line number 1 is the correct line. And, if one person said it, then maybe you just think, oh, well, one person has made a mistake. But if every single person before you says that line 1 is the same length, maybe you start doubting yourself. Maybe you think that the rest of the group knows something that you don't know. Or maybe you don't want to say the wrong thing and go against the group. Some of our reasons for conforming on this previous slide. So maybe when it comes to be your turn, you're going to say that it's line 2, or maybe you're going to go with the group and say it's line 1. Now, what factors influence whether you go with the group or if you say the real correct answer? We can talk about things like group size. So if you're in a group of only like 1 or 2 or 3, then you're probably going to say what you think is right. But as the group gets larger, as you get up to at least a group size of about 5, it becomes more likely that people are going to go along with the group, even if they think the group is wrong. Now, interestingly, this effective group size isn't sort of a consistent relationship. It's not that as the group gets larger, you are more and more likely to conform. There's a certain point where it doesn't matter if you're in a group of 10 or if you're in a group of 50, your rate of agreement or disagreement with the group response is going to be about the same. So group size affects it to a point. Something else that affects conformity is the presence of a dissenter, basically having one other person who goes against what the whole group is saying. So if we have a group of 10 people, and you're going second last with that line experiment, and the first 7 people say that it's line 1, and you're starting to doubt yourself, if one other person says, no, it's line 2, all of a sudden you're relieved. You think it's not you. Those other people are just wrong, and they're definitely just not seeing it the same way. So you would say line 2 because at least one other person dissented or disagreed with the group, and now you start feeling safer to disagree with the group as well. There's also an influence of type of culture. Collectivistic cultures, basically cultures that value a group more than an individual, are going to value conformity because that agreement, that harmony within the group is more important than one individual's opinion. And a really interesting one here is that there seems to be, across multiple different studies, and by multiple I mean like thousands of different studies, that there aren't really differences in gender when it comes to conformity. It's not that men or women are more or less likely to conform. It seems to be pretty much equal across the board. Now, all of this has been focused on what does the majority of the group say? What does the largest portion of the group think? But we can also consider a minority influence. What about a small subset of the group that disagrees with the majority? When do you start paying attention to that minority instead of the majority? A member of this minority who wants to influence the group has the best chance of doing this, or has the strongest argument, when they are very committed to their point of view. If they are absolutely adamant that not line 1 or 2 is correct, but maybe line 3, if they are more consistent and independent in the face of pressure, so if they are committed to this point of view, they are adamant about it, they consistently select the same line and consistently argue for the same line, and they remain independent even in the face of pressure, so they're not being bullied into selecting 1 or 2 as the correct line, those are all going to help give them some strength to their argument. And it also seems to work best when these minority influencers appear to keep an open mind. So if they will listen to the arguments or the encouragement of people in the majority, but still stick to their point, that's when they're more likely to start influencing others from the majority to maybe shift their beliefs to match this intense minority. And of course, I'm talking about this in terms of that one experiment, but this works in multiple different scenarios, both in and out of the lab. There are some special cases where a minority's influence can be undermined, especially if that minority has a very extreme or unreasonable or even negative point of view. If people are too put off by the thing that they're proposing or suggesting or arguing for, then the majority might become more entrenched in their idea, or they might even become more extreme in the opposite point than what the minority is trying to tell them about. So there are some cases when this can backfire. Next, we're going to move on to talking about obedience and especially how it matters for authority. And the big psychological experiment to talk about when we talk about authority and obedience to authority is the Milgram experiment. Now, this is, again, the famous example of obedience to authority. I would highly recommend, if you haven't heard of the Milgram experiment yet, take a few minutes, hop onto YouTube and look up just a short video on what it was about, because I'm not going to be able to do it complete justice here. This is another one of those experiments that gets brought up a lot when we have discussions about ethics, because there were some pretty massive ethical ramifications from this experiment. But just like with the Stanford prison experiment, we're going to focus on the experiment itself, and you can sort of logically interpret some of the ethical issues that might have been, just from what we talked about ethics earlier in the course. But the very basics for Milgram's experiment was that you had some undergraduate participants who would come in and they were being instructed to take part in an experiment where they were being being paired with another individual who they didn't know was actually part of the experiment. So there was a confederate, someone who was in on the ruse, but the participant, the person who had been selected to participate in the experiment, they assumed that the other confederate, the other person, was just another participant just like them. So our participant was put in a room and told that their partner, the confederate, was going to be answering questions. And each time they answered a question incorrectly, there was going to be a punishment of increasingly intense shocks. And the participant had to deliver the shocks. So the experimenter would stay in the room, and each time a question was asked, if the confederate answered the question wrong, which they were frequently instructed to do, the participant had to push a button and deliver an electric shock. And the experimenter would tell them that they had to deliver the shock, and that each time a mistake was made, the intensity of the shock had to be increased. So the participant is sitting there giving these increasingly more and more intense shocks to who they believed was just some other undergraduate student who was partaking in this experiment. But we were asking, how far would these participants go? How long would they deliver the shocks for? What would push them to the point where they would say no? And so this is why this experiment was both unethical, but also really important in understanding how people obeyed authorities. So this is a very busy graph of the results of this experiment. So let's walk through what's going on. So this axis here, our y-axis, is the percentage of people obeying the command at each shock level. So how many people are obeying the authority who are listening to the experimenter when they say, deliver the shock. Across the bottom, we have the intensity of the shock. And remember, there were no actual shocks delivered. This is just what the participant thought they were delivering. So from a very mild 15-volt shock up to severely dangerous and potentially deadly 300 to 400-volt shocks. And this is just indications of what the confederate would say, what the actor was doing in response to these fake shocks. So at the very beginning, pretty much everybody would push the button and deliver these mild shocks. And the confederate would say something like, ugh, or ow, or that hurts. So just sort of mild acknowledgement that these fake shocks were happening. And then as time goes on, you see that as the shocks get more intense, people start dropping out, but not very quickly. So at this point, where we start seeing a large drop-off, they start yelling, get me out of here, my heart's starting to bother me, because there were some modifications of this experiment where the confederate had a heart condition or had a weak constitution or all sorts of different modifications to try and figure out which statements could convince people to stop obeying this authority. And so they go on into screaming and intense screaming, and then eventually they stop responding. And yet, despite going through all of these intense responses, we're still sitting at about a 65% obedience level. So people were obeying the experimenter. They were delivering these shocks, even beyond the point where they potentially could think that they had killed the other participant. And that's where the ethical side of things comes into play, because there was a lot of trauma for the participants who felt that they had possibly done serious harm to other people. And they were put off and worried by the fact that their behavior had been so extreme. They had obeyed past the point that they ever thought they could have. And it's important, again, to note that there were no gender differences, no sex differences in percentage of responding and percentage of obedience here. overall, about 60% of people followed through to the completion of the experiment, where the experimenters stopped and had to tell them what was going on, which is intense and extreme. Now, I mentioned that there were there were many different variants of this particular experiment. And they varied in such a way as to try and give the researchers an idea of which factors influenced how likely people were to obey. And some of the factors that they came up with were things like the remoteness of the victim. If the Confederate was in the same room as the person delivering the shocks, as the participant, they were a lot more likely to disobey because the person was right there and they could see the effect of their action. So the more remote the victim, the easier it is to obey an authority figure. Another factor is the closeness and legitimacy of that authority figure. So if the researcher is standing there in the room and telling you to your face that you have to do this, people are a lot more likely to obey. If the researcher was delivering the instructions over the telephone or over a speaker, people were a lot less likely to follow through. And if you replaced the authority figure of the researcher with some other person, maybe another Confederate that you thought was another participant, then obedience levels would drop, because why would you obey someone who doesn't have any authority? We also come up with a lot of evidence for this idea of being a cog in a wheel. So if you were the participant and you didn't have to push the button, maybe you just had to set the machine to a higher voltage, but someone else was pushing the button, people were a lot more likely to obey because they're not doing the task itself. That's somebody else is doing the bad thing. All I'm doing is setting up a machine. That's someone else's problem. And there's also an effect of personal characteristics, things like your political orientation, your occupation, religious beliefs, things that matter to you. So each individual's characteristics and constitution would contribute to how likely they were to go along with a particular setup. And I'm talking about this in terms of, again, this obedience study, but you can start seeing how a lot of this would apply to things out in the real world. Things like people who were involved in the Holocaust. A lot of these factors were fairly well exploited to try and get people to go along with what was happening during the Holocaust. And we see problems with this even to this day. There's issues as sort of, I guess, mundane in comparison to the Holocaust as pilots. So when you're in a plane, you have your pilot and your co-pilot. And the co-pilot is supposed to stand up and disagree with the pilot if the pilot does something wrong. But in a lot of studies looking at planes that have crashed or problems that have happened, it's because the co-pilots didn't want to stand up to the authority figure that is the pilot. So we could take from all of these different situations that there's a big effect of people in authority, and people who are under that authority are very reluctant to stand up and go against that authority. So next we're going to start talking about how you can be more aware of and resist some compliance techniques. And we're going to frame them a little bit more in terms of things like dealing with telemarketers or dealing with people asking for donations, because there are lots of psychological tips and tricks to get people to feel that they owe you something, where they feel like they should be responding or complying with a particular request. So we're going to talk about some of the most common compliance techniques and how you can be aware of them to maybe not be as influenced by them in the future. So the first of these compliance techniques is the norm of reciprocity, which is basically the expectation that when others treat us well, we should respond in kind. So this image here is showing a particular setup where they were using the norm of reciprocity to try and get more donations for a particular cause. So these individuals would have a bunch of flowers with them, and they would walk around in the crowds and they would say, "Here, this is a gift. Please take this gift," and hand them a flower. Now, because of this norm of reciprocity, because they've done something nice for us, we feel obligated to do something nice in return. So if you're offered a gift of a flower and then asked for a donation, people are a lot more likely to give a donation because they feel like they should reciprocate. They should do something kind in return for having been given a flower. And in fact, you can find that people donate significantly more money after they've been given a flower than if they were just asked to donate. The next compliance technique that we can talk about is the door in the face technique. And this is where someone who's trying to persuade you to do something starts off by making a large request. Maybe your friend wants something from you, and so they come over and they say, "Hey, can you lend me $100? And that's a huge request, but they expect you to immediately refuse that. That's the door in the face side of things, where you would immediately say, "No, I don't have that much money. I can't do that for you." The persuader then makes a smaller request. "Okay, well, if you can't give me $100, could you give me 10? And people, again, are a lot more likely to respond to this smaller request because all of a sudden it seems more reasonable. $100 wasn't reasonable, but 10, yeah, that's doable. Sure, here's $10. And again, repeated studies have shown that people who are initially asked to make a larger donation or to do a larger task, and they're then subsequently asked to do a smaller task when they refuse, they're a lot more likely to do that smaller task than if you had just asked them to do the smaller thing first. So if your friend asked you for $10 and you were probably going to say no, maybe, depending on who you are and who your friend is, but maybe you would say no. But having this asked for $100 first and then asked for 10, you'd be a little bit more likely to give him the $10 because of this particular technique and how we respond to it. On the other side of the spectrum, we can have the foot in the door technique, where instead of starting with a large request, your persuader actually starts with a small request. So maybe they ask if they can borrow your pencil. It's like, "Okay, yeah, I don't mind if I lend you this pencil in class." The persuader could then come back and ask you for something a little bit larger, like, "Hey, could you now give me $10? And because you've already done something for them, you kind of feel like, yeah, why not do one more thing? So because I've already helped them out with something, why not help them with something else?" And that's kind of related to the next technique, which is called lowballing, which is where the persuader gets you to commit to some action. So you ask them to give you $10 and they say, "Yeah, sure, fine." But before that action is performed, the persuader is going to increase the cost of the action. So if you agree to give your friend $10 and then you pull out your wallet and they go, "Oh, shoot, actually, I need 20 because of this reason." Because you've already committed to that action, you're a lot more likely to go through with it and give them a $20 bill instead of just a 10 like you had originally agreed. So these two techniques seem very similar, the foot in the door technique and lowballing, but with lowballing, it's the same basic action. So I ask you for $10 and then 20, so I've just made the cost of the same thing larger. Whereas the foot in the door technique is that you start with one particular request that doesn't have anything to do with the second request. So I ask you to borrow a pencil so that you start to warm up to me, and then I ask you for money or something like that. So they're both the idea of scaling up your requests, but one is involving two not directly related requests, and one is the same request just escalated. Now, before I move on to that next slide, I did mention that we should talk about how you can avoid these techniques. And the biggest part of avoiding being tricked by these techniques is to be aware of their existence. So if you're on the phone and a telemarketer calls and they're raising money for something, if they ask you to make a $100 donation and you say no, and then they ask for a $20 donation, you can say in your mind, like, oh, I know exactly what they're doing. They're using the door in the face technique. Cool. And that doesn't mean that you immediately then have to refuse. It's just that when you're aware of these tricks, you're aware of these techniques, you're not going to be mindlessly fooled by them. Now you can make an educated decision and choose if you want to do the task that's being requested based on the merit of that task and not on the psychological tricks that got you there. And then the very last slide here is going to help us transition into the next section where we start talking on group influences and things like that. And this is just a very brief chat about crowd behavior and the idea of de-individuation. So people spend a lot of our time in crowds. We're around people fairly often, a lot less nowadays, but people tend to behave fairly differently in crowds. The textbook talks about cases where when people are standing on buildings threatening to jump, crowds that gather every once in a while will come to the point where they start encouraging the person to jump. And researchers looked at that and wondered, how on earth did normal everyday people get to the point where they're encouraging someone to take their own life? What is going on here? And the basic idea that they've come up with is the idea of de-individuation, that loss of your individuality. So you start thinking as a group as opposed to thinking of yourself as an individual. And so as soon as you start paying less attention to yourself and more attention to the group, it seems to lead to more disinhibited behaviors, where you might go along with a group encouraging people to commit suicide, take part in riots, or be part of a group that's committing genocide. So there are lots of ways that being part of this group can lead you to ignore your own individual values. Now, again, researchers have been really interested in this and done lots of studies to figure out what the heck is going on. And the key point to this seems to be anonymity to outsiders. If nobody can identify you, if you're kept independent and separate and unidentifiable, you feel more as part of a group and you forget about yourself as an individual. You're more likely to respond to those group norms and go along with the group's behavior if nobody can tell that you're part of that group. So that's going to reduce your feelings of accountability. So a large way of breaking this cycle is to have people feel like they're going to be held accountable. Single people out, make them realize that they're an individual who can be identified and may be held accountable for those for those behaviors. So it's sort of one way to try and get around this de-individuation. But again, very complex issues that we spend very brief times on.